At 5 feet 2 inches tall and weighing barely 115 pounds, Casey Morales was told she was too small for combat. The Marines said she lacked the physical strength for the front lines, but when enemy fire trapped 8 Marines in a collapsed building with no way out, Casey did something that military textbooks said was impossible. She carried each one of them to safety, one by one, through a quarter-mile of hostile territory. This is the story of how the smallest Marine became the biggest hero. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Casey Morales first knew she wanted to be a Marine when she was 8 years old, standing in her grandmother's living room in Tucson, Arizona, staring at a faded photograph on the mantle. The picture showed her mother, Command Sergeant Major Diana Morales, in full dress uniform, chest decorated with ribbons and medals from 3 combat deployments. But it wasn't the decorations that captivated young Casey. It was the look in her mother's eyes. Fierce, determined, unbreakable. "Tell me about Afghanistan again, Mom," Casey would ask every evening as her mother tucked her into bed. Diana would sit on the edge of the mattress, still smelling faintly of the motor oil and gun-cleaning solvent from her work at the local Veterans Center, and paint vivid pictures of dusty mountains, convoy missions, and the brotherhood of soldiers who depended on each other for survival. "The most important thing you can do," Diana would always conclude, "is be there when someone needs you most. Size doesn't matter. Heart does." Casey absorbed these stories like a sponge, but it was one particular tale that shaped her destiny. Her mother had once carried a wounded soldier nearly 2 miles through enemy territory after their vehicle was destroyed by an IED. The injured man weighed 190 pounds, more than Diana's own body weight, but she had managed to get him to the evacuation point alive. "How did you do it, Mom? How did you carry someone so much bigger than you?" Diana smiled, flexing her still impressive biceps. "Your body can do things your mind can't imagine, mija. But first, your mind has to believe it's possible." From that moment, Casey's bedroom walls became a shrine to military excellence. Pictures of female Marines in combat gear, motivational quotes written in her careful 8-year-old handwriting, and a detailed workout schedule that she followed religiously. Every morning before school, Casey would run 3 miles through the desert neighborhood surrounding their modest home. She did push-ups until her arms shook, sit-ups until her stomach burned, and pull-ups on the rusty swing set in their backyard until her palms bled. Her classmates thought she was crazy. While other girls her age were interested in makeup and movies, Casey was studying military field manuals and practicing tactical movements in the vacant lot behind their house. She joined every sports team available, track, soccer, volleyball, wrestling, not because she particularly enjoyed them, but because each sport developed different aspects of the physical and mental toughness she knew she would need. "Casey's gonna be a Marine," her mother would tell anyone who asked about her daughter's unusual dedication. "She's been preparing for it since she could walk." The preparation wasn't just physical. Diana made sure Casey understood the intellectual demands of modern military service. Mathematics, because trajectory calculations and logistics required precision. Science, because understanding how equipment worked could mean the difference between life and death. Geography, because knowing terrain could save lives. Leadership, because even the lowest-ranking Marine might need to take charge in a crisis. Casey excelled academically, but her real passion remained physical training. She convinced her mother to enroll her in martial arts classes, where she learned that technique could overcome size disadvantages. She studied rock climbing, which taught her how to use her entire body efficiently, and she even took ballet, despite the protests of her more traditionally minded relatives, because the balance and body control translated directly to combat movement. By the time Casey reached high school, she had transformed from a small, determined 8-year-old into a compact powerhouse. She stood just over 5 feet tall, but her body was pure muscle and sinew. Her mile time was faster than most of the boys on the track team. She could do more pull-ups than the football players. Her hand-to-hand combat skills, developed through years of martial arts training, were formidable enough that even larger opponents approached her with respect. But it was her mental toughness that truly set Casey apart. During her junior year, the school organized a charity hike in the nearby mountains. The goal was to complete a 10-mile trail that wound through challenging terrain with elevation changes that left most participants exhausted and struggling. Casey not only finished first, but when she discovered that several classmates had become lost on a side trail, she hiked back to find them and personally guided each one to safety.
"That girl has something special," the hiking instructor told Diana later. "I've never seen someone so young display that kind of leadership under pressure." Casey's reputation for helping others became legendary at her school. When the basketball team's bus broke down 15 miles from town after a game, Casey organized the team into pairs and led them on a night march back to school, arriving safely just as the sun rose. When a flash flood trapped campers at the annual senior class camping trip, Casey waded into the rushing water repeatedly to help evacuate everyone to higher ground. These incidents weren't accidents. They were the result of years of purposeful preparation. Casey had studied emergency response procedures, practiced navigation in difficult conditions, and trained her body to perform when others would give up. She understood that real leadership meant being ready for situations that no one expected. Her mother watched with growing pride and concern. Pride because Casey was exceeding even Diana's ambitious expectations. Concern because the military Casey dreamed of joining was still struggling with how to fully integrate women into combat roles. "The rules are changing, Mija," Diana told her daughter during one of their evening conversations. "But they're changing slowly. You need to be prepared for people who will judge you before they see what you can do." Casey nodded seriously. She had already experienced this discrimination in smaller ways: coaches who initially doubted her capabilities, classmates who assumed she was fragile, teachers who suggested she might be happier in less physically demanding activities. But each time, she had responded the same way, by performing beyond expectations and proving her critics wrong. During her senior year, Casey began the formal process of joining the Marines. The recruiter, Staff Sergeant Williams, was impressed by her fitness scores and academic achievements, but he was honest about the challenges she would face. "The physical standards are the same for everyone," he explained. "And some military occupational specialties have additional requirements that might be challenging for someone of your stature." Casey looked him directly in the eye. "Staff Sergeant, I've been preparing for this my entire life. Whatever the requirements are, I'll meet them." Williams had seen plenty of enthusiastic recruits who overestimated their capabilities, but something about Casey's quiet confidence convinced him that she was different. He scheduled her for preliminary fitness testing, expecting to either confirm his suspicions about her potential or gently redirect her toward more realistic goals. The fitness test results shocked everyone involved. Casey's scores weren't just acceptable, they were exceptional. Her 3-mile run time was faster than 85% of male recruits. Her pull-up count exceeded the maximum standards for women her age group. Her combat fitness test, which measured practical skills like ammunition can lifts and movement under fire, placed her in the top 10% of all recruits, regardless of gender. But it was the unofficial test that truly impressed Staff Sergeant Williams. At the end of the formal evaluation, he mentioned that they were shorthanded in moving equipment from the testing facility back to storage. Without being asked, Casey immediately volunteered to help. For the next 2 hours, she carried, lifted, and hauled gear alongside Marines who outweighed her by 50 pounds or more. She never complained, never asked for breaks, and never showed signs of fatigue. "Morales, you might just be what the Corps has been looking for." Casey's mother attended the enlistment ceremony, wearing her own dress uniform despite being retired for 5 years. As Casey raised her right hand to take the oath, Diana felt a mixture of overwhelming pride and deep anxiety. Her daughter had worked toward this moment for a decade, but Diana knew that the real challenges were just beginning. "I do solemnly swear to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic," Casey recited, her voice clear and unwavering. But even as she spoke the words, both mother and daughter understood that Casey would need to prove herself again and again. The Marines she was joining might accept her oath, but they would reserve judgment about her capabilities until she demonstrated them under real conditions. That night, as Casey packed for boot camp, she found a note from her mother tucked between her folded clothes. "Mija, you carry our family's honor with you. But more importantly, you carry your own strength. Trust it, even when others don't." Casey folded the note carefully and placed it in her wallet, where it would stay throughout her military career. She looked at herself in the mirror, seeing not a small woman who might struggle to meet expectations, but a Marine who had been preparing for this moment her entire life. She had no way of knowing that within 2 years, that preparation would save the lives of 8 fellow Marines in a way that would redefine what the military understood about strength, courage, and the power of refusing to give up when others were counting on you.
Marine Corps Recruit Depot Paris Island was everything Casey had imagined and nothing she was prepared for. The humid South Carolina air hit her like a wall as she stepped off the bus at 0300 hours, surrounded by 60 other recruits who looked just as terrified and determined as she felt. Drill instructor Staff Sergeant Martinez, a mountain of a man with a voice that could shatter glass, immediately began the process of breaking them down to build them back up. Ladies and gentlemen, for the next 13 weeks, your comfort zone no longer exists, Martinez bellowed as the new recruits scrambled to form ranks. Some of you think you know what tough means. You're about to find out you were wrong. Casey stood at attention in the second rank, her 5'2" frame dwarfed by the recruits around her. The woman to her left was nearly 6 feet tall, with shoulders like a linebacker. The man to her right looked like he could bench press a small car. But Casey had learned long ago that size was just one factor in the equation of success. The first weeks of boot camp were a brutal symphony of physical training, academic instruction, and psychological pressure designed to weed out anyone who lacked the commitment to become a Marine. Casey excelled in areas where her preparation showed. She consistently finished in the top 5 during runs, her academic scores were among the highest in the platoon, and her attention to detail during inspections was flawless. But it was during the practical exercises that Casey truly began to distinguish herself. The obstacle course, designed to test recruits' ability to overcome barriers under pressure, had claimed more than a few casualties among her fellow trainees. The rope climb, in particular, had become a source of anxiety for several recruits who struggled with the upper body strength requirements. Casey approached the rope climb with the same methodical precision she had brought to every challenge in her life. While larger recruits tried to muscle their way up using brute force, Casey employed the technique she had learned during years of rock climbing training. She used her legs as much as her arms, maintaining 3 points of contact at all times, and moved with fluid efficiency that conserved energy while maintaining speed. "Recruit Morales," D.I. Martinez called out as Casey reached the top of the rope for the 3rd time that session. "Demonstrate proper technique for the platoon." What followed was Casey's first real moment of leadership among her peers. She patiently explained how smaller Marines could overcome strength disadvantages through proper technique, showing recruits how to position their feet to take pressure off their arms and how to pace their breathing to maintain endurance. Several recruits who had been struggling with the rope climb began to show improvement immediately. But it was during the combat fitness test that Casey's true capabilities became apparent to her instructors. The CFT was designed to measure combat-related fitness through 3 events: an 880-yard sprint, ammunition can lifts, and a maneuver under fire course that required crawling, carrying, and tactical movement while wearing full gear. The ammunition can lift had been a source of concern for Casey's instructors. The exercise required recruits to lift 30-pound cans from chest height to overhead as many times as possible in 2 minutes. Given Casey's compact build, expectations were modest. She needed 17 repetitions to pass and 50 to achieve the maximum score. Casey completed 73 repetitions. The number was so far outside the normal range that D.I. Martinez initially suspected an error in counting, but 3 different instructors had been watching and all confirmed the same result. Casey had lifted more than 2,000 pounds in 2 minutes, a feat that placed her in the top 1% of all Marines, regardless of gender or weight class. "How the hell did you do that, Morales?" Martinez asked after dismissing the other recruits. "Drill instructor, I've been training for this specific movement for 8 years. Proper form, breathing control, and mental preparation." Martinez studied her thoughtfully. He had been a drill instructor for 6 years and had seen thousands of recruits pass through Paris Island. He knew potential when he saw it, and Casey Morales had something extraordinary. The combat fitness course confirmed Martinez's assessment. The course required recruits to navigate 300 yards of varied terrain while carrying equipment, crawling under obstacles, and responding to simulated combat scenarios while wearing full gear. Most recruits completed the course successfully, but with visible signs of fatigue and stress. Casey moved through the course like it had been designed specifically for her. Her small stature allowed her to navigate low obstacles more efficiently than larger recruits. Her endurance training meant she maintained the same pace from start to finish. Her tactical knowledge, absorbed through years of studying military procedures, helped her make quick decisions during the simulated combat scenarios.
When she crossed the finish line, Casey's breathing was elevated but controlled. Her uniform was dirty, but not soaked with sweat like most other recruits. She looked like she could run the course again immediately if asked. "Outstanding performance, Recruit Morales," Martinez said, making notes on his clipboard. "What's your desired military occupational specialty?" "Infantry drill instructor, 0311 rifleman." Martinez's pen stopped moving. He looked up at Casey, then down at her performance scores, then back at Casey again. Infantry was the backbone of the Marine Corps, but it was also one of the most physically demanding specialties. Combat operations required Marines to carry heavy equipment over long distances, often while under fire. The average infantry Marine was expected to function effectively while carrying 80 to 120 pounds of gear. Morales, infantry requires Marines to carry significant weight over extended distances. Are you confident you can meet those demands? Yes, drill instructor. I've been training with weighted packs since I was 12 years old. This was true. Casey's weekend training regimens had included hiking with progressively heavier backpacks through the Arizona desert. By her senior year of high school, she was routinely completing 15-mile hikes while carrying 60 pounds of gear, often in temperatures exceeding 100 degrees. Martinez made more notes. He had seen plenty of recruits who performed well in controlled training environments, but struggled when faced with the unpredictable demands of real-world military operations. But something about Casey's quiet confidence suggested she understood exactly what she was volunteering for. The weapons training phase of boot camp provided additional evidence of Casey's exceptional preparation. While many recruits struggled to achieve basic marksmanship scores with the M16A Force Service rifle, Casey consistently shot expert-level scores. Her understanding of ballistics, windage, and range estimation had been developed through years of hunting with her mother in the Arizona wilderness. But it was her performance with heavier crew-served weapons that truly impressed her instructors. The M240B machine gun weighed 27 pounds and required significant upper body strength to operate effectively. Most female recruits, and many male recruits, found the weapon challenging to handle during extended firing exercises. Casey operated the M240B like it was an extension of her own body. She could maintain accurate fire during rapid movement, quickly change firing positions, and carry the weapon over long distances without visible fatigue. Her technical knowledge of the weapon system allowed her to perform maintenance and repairs that many more experienced Marines struggled with. Recruit Morales has demonstrated exceptional proficiency with all weapon systems, her marksmanship instructor noted in his evaluation. Recommend advancement to specialized training programs. As graduation from boot camp approached, Casey's performance had earned her recognition as one of the outstanding recruits in her training platoon. She had achieved perfect scores on academic examinations, exceeded physical fitness standards in every category, and demonstrated leadership qualities that impressed her instructors. But she was also aware that boot camp was just the beginning. The Marines she was about to join had been fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan for over a decade. They had developed their own understanding of what worked in combat, and that understanding would be tested against Casey's theoretical preparation and training scores. On graduation day, as Casey stood in formation wearing her dress blue uniform for the first time, she felt the weight of every mile she had run, every push-up she had completed, and every hour she had spent studying military procedures. Her mother, wearing her own dress blue uniform, watched from the stands with tears in her eyes. But even as she celebrated this achievement, she knew the real test was still ahead. Boot camp had proven she could meet the Marine Corps standards. Now she needed to prove she could exceed them when it mattered most. The orders that would determine her future were waiting in her graduation packet. Infantry Training Battalion, Camp Geiger, North Carolina. She would have 13 more weeks to prove that a 5'2" Marine could perform every mission the Corps might ask of her. Casey folded her orders carefully and placed them in her pocket next to her mother's note. She had taken the first step toward her dream, but she understood that dreams and reality would soon collide in ways that no amount of training could fully prepare her for.
Infantry Training Battalion at Camp Geiger was where Marines learned to kill and survive. The sprawling North Carolina facility had been forging combat Marines for decades, and its reputation for brutality was well earned. Casey arrived on a gray February morning, her sea bag slung over her shoulder, ready to prove that her boot camp performance was just the beginning of what she could accomplish. The first shock came during in-processing. Casey joined a formation of newly arrived Marines waiting for assignment to training companies. Looking around, she realized she was the only woman in a group of nearly 200 recruits. The Marine Corps had only recently opened infantry training to female Marines, and Casey was part of the first small group of women to attempt the program. Staff Sergeant Frank Sullivan, the company's senior instructor, addressed the formation with the kind of gravelly voice that suggested years of shouting orders in combat zones. Sullivan was a compact man himself, maybe 5'8", but built like a concrete block, with arms that looked like they could bend steel. "Gentlemen and lady," Sullivan began, his eyes finding Casey immediately, "for the next 13 weeks, you will learn every skill necessary to close with and destroy the enemy. Some of you will excel. Some of you will struggle. Some of you will fail and be reassigned to other specialties. The infantry doesn't compromise its standards for anyone." The emphasis on anyone wasn't subtle. Casey felt the weight of 60 pairs of eyes turning toward her, most expressing curiosity, some showing skepticism, a few radiating outright hostility. She kept her expression neutral and her posture perfect, just as her mother had taught her. The academic portion of infantry training played to Casey's strengths. She excelled in classes on tactics, weapon systems, and field medicine. Her years of studying military procedures meant she could recite the characteristics of enemy weapons, explain complex tactical maneuvers, and troubleshoot communication equipment failures that left other students confused. But it was during the physical training that Casey's size became a constant source of evaluation and doubt. The infantry training program was designed around the assumption that Marines would need to carry enormous loads over long distances in hostile environments. The standard combat load for an infantry Marine exceeded 80 pounds, not including additional equipment that might be required for specific missions. During the first major field exercise, each Marine was required to complete a 15-mile movement carrying full combat gear, plus additional ammunition for the squad's machine guns. The total weight approached 120 pounds, more than Casey's entire body weight. Casey had prepared for this moment throughout her life. She adjusted her pack carefully, distributing weight to maximize efficiency and minimize stress on any single muscle group. She checked every strap, buckle, and piece of gear to ensure nothing would shift or cause problems during the movement. As the formation moved out in the pre-dawn darkness, Casey settled into the rhythm she had perfected during years of training in the Arizona desert. Her stride was shorter than the Marines around her, but her pace was consistent and sustainable. While larger Marines tried to muscle through the exercise using brute strength, Casey relied on technique, mental preparation, and cardiovascular conditioning that exceeded anything her instructors had seen. By the halfway point, several Marines had begun to struggle visibly. Pack straps were cutting into shoulders, breathing was labored, and the formation was starting to spread out as stronger Marines pulled ahead and weaker ones fell behind. Casey remained exactly where she had started, in the middle of the formation, maintaining the prescribed pace with no visible signs of distress. Her breathing was controlled, her posture remained correct, and she showed no indication that carrying 120 pounds was any more challenging than her daily morning run. Staff Sergeant Sullivan, who had been moving up and down the formation monitoring progress, found himself repeatedly checking on Casey's position. He had expected her to fall behind early, requiring encouragement or assistance to complete the exercise. Instead, she was performing better than Marines who outweighed her by 70 pounds. But when the formation reached the 12-mile mark, disaster struck for one of the larger recruits. Private Johnson, a 220-pound former college football player, collapsed with what appeared to be heat exhaustion. His pack had been improperly adjusted, cutting off circulation to his arms, and his competitive instincts had pushed him beyond his limits. Without hesitation, Casey dropped her own pack and moved to assist Johnson. She quickly diagnosed the problem with his gear, redistributed his load to reduce pressure points, and helped him to his feet. When Johnson proved unable to continue carrying his full load, Casey quietly redistributed some of his equipment among nearby Marines, including taking an additional 15 pounds onto her already loaded frame. The exercise concluded with Casey finishing in the middle of the pack while carrying more weight than she had started with, having provided medical assistance to a fellow Marine, and showing no signs of the exhaustion that had affected much larger and theoretically stronger recruits. Staff Sergeant Sullivan was beginning to understand that his assumptions about Casey's capabilities had been wrong. But the Marine Corps infantry was a system built on traditions, standards, and procedures that had been developed over decades of combat experience. Individual, exceptional performance didn't automatically translate to policy changes. The breaking point came during Week 8 of training. The exercise was a simulated patrol in enemy territory, requiring Marines to move through difficult terrain while carrying combat loads and maintaining tactical awareness. The scenario included a casualty evacuation component. Marines would need to carry wounded teammates to safety while under simulated enemy fire. Casey's squad had been moving through dense woodland when the exercise controllers triggered the casualty scenario. Private Martinez, a 185-pound Marine, was designated as critically wounded and unable to walk. The squad needed to evacuate him to a landing zone 800 meters away through terrain that included steep hills, dense vegetation, and simulated enemy positions. The squad leader, a large Marine named Corporal Brooks, immediately assigned the two biggest Marines to carry Martinez using a standard two-person carry. But the terrain made this approach nearly impossible. The dense vegetation and narrow trails prevented two people from moving side by side while carrying a casualty. After 10 minutes of struggling with the two-person carry, the squad had made less than 100 meters of progress. The exercise controllers were providing increasing pressure through simulated enemy contact, and it was clear that the current approach would result in mission failure. "I can carry him," Casey said quietly. Corporal Brooks looked at her skeptically. Martinez weighs 185 pounds. You weigh maybe 115. The math doesn't work." "Give me a chance," Casey replied. "If I can't do it, we'll try something else." Casey positioned Martinez across her shoulders in a fireman's carry, a technique she had practiced countless times with weighted dummies. The key was not just strength, it was balance, breathing control, and understanding how to use her entire body efficiently. What happened next became legendary in infantry training circles. Casey carried Martinez the entire 800 meters to the evacuation point. She navigated steep terrain, crawled under obstacles while maintaining the carry, and responded to tactical scenarios without ever setting her casualty down. Her pace was steady, her breathing controlled, and she showed no signs of the physical distress that should have been inevitable. The exercise controllers, who had expected the scenario to take 45 minutes or more, watched in amazement as Casey completed the evacuation in 22 minutes. Her technique was flawless, her tactical awareness remained sharp throughout the movement, and she finished the exercise looking like she could do it again immediately if required. Staff Sergeant Sullivan pulled Casey aside after the exercise. "Samans, that was the most impressive display of strength and endurance I've seen in 15 years of infantry training. But we need to talk." The conversation that followed changed the trajectory of Casey's military career. Sullivan explained that while her performance had been exceptional, the Marine Corps was facing political pressure regarding women in infantry roles. Some officials were looking for any excuse to demonstrate that the integration policy was premature or unsuccessful. "Your capabilities are not in question," Sullivan said carefully, "but there are people above my pay grade who are concerned about unit cohesion, logistical challenges, and maintaining standards. They're looking for reasons to justify policy restrictions." Casey felt the familiar sensation of doors closing despite her performance exceeding every expectation. "What are you saying, Staff Sergeant?" "I'm saying that politics sometimes matter more than performance, and right now, the politics aren't favorable for female Marines in infantry roles, regardless of their capabilities." The official notification came 2 days later. Casey was being reassigned to a military occupational specialty that would better utilize her demonstrated skills while maintaining unit effectiveness. The language was bureaucratic and careful, but the meaning was clear. She was being removed from infantry training not because she had failed to meet standards, but because her success was inconvenient for people making decisions based on factors other than performance. Casey read the reassignment orders 3 times, each reading hitting harder than the last. She had exceeded every physical standard, outperformed Marines twice her size, and demonstrated capabilities that impressed even skeptical instructors. But none of that mattered when policies were being driven by politics rather than performance. That night, Casey called her mother from a payphone outside the barracks. Through tears she had refused to shed in front of her instructors, she explained what had happened. "Mija," Diana said softly, "this isn't the end of your story. It's just a different chapter than the one you planned to write." Casey wiped her eyes and straightened her shoulders. Her mother was right. This wasn't over. It was just beginning differently than she had expected.
Casey's new orders arrived with all the ceremony of a parking ticket. Field medical technician training at Marine Corps Base Camp Lejeune. The Military Occupational Specialty Code 8404 came with a polite explanation that her exceptional physical capabilities and attention to detail made her ideal for providing medical support to combat units. It was a consolation prize wrapped in official language, and everyone involved knew it. The medical training facility at Camp Lejeune felt like a different world from the aggressive intensity of infantry school. Here, Marines learned to save lives rather than take them, to heal rather than destroy. The irony wasn't lost on Casey. She had been deemed too small to carry weapons into combat, but perfectly sized to carry wounded Marines out of it. Chief Petty Officer Rebecca Hayes, the lead instructor for field medical training, was a Navy corpsman with 12 years of experience providing medical support to Marine units. Hayes was known for her no-nonsense approach and her ability to train Marines to function as medics under the kind of pressure that turned some people into heroes and others into casualties. "Welcome to the most important job in the Marine Corps," Hayes told the new class of medical trainees. "Infantry Marines break things and kill people. You put Marines back together so they can continue breaking things and killing people. Without you, the mission fails." Casey threw herself into medical training with the same intensity she had brought to every other challenge in her life. She studied anatomy until she could identify every bone, muscle, and organ in the human body. She practiced medical procedures until her hands moved automatically through trauma protocols. She memorized drug dosages, treatment procedures, and evacuation protocols for every type of injury Marines might sustain in combat. But it was during the practical training exercises that Casey's unique combination of skills began to distinguish her from other medical trainees. The training scenarios required medics to provide treatment under simulated combat conditions, crawling to wounded Marines under enemy fire, stabilizing casualties while explosions detonated nearby, and evacuating patients through difficult terrain while maintaining medical care. Casey's physical conditioning, developed through years of preparation for infantry training, made her exceptionally effective in these high-stress scenarios. While other medics struggled to move quickly while carrying medical equipment, Casey could sprint to casualties, provide treatment, and evacuate patients with an efficiency that impressed even experienced instructors. Her first major evaluation came during a mass casualty exercise designed to test medics' ability to prioritize care when facing multiple wounded Marines simultaneously. The scenario involved a simulated IED explosion that had created 5 casualties with varying degrees of injury. Medics had to quickly assess each casualty, prioritize treatment based on severity and survivability, and provide appropriate care while calling for evacuation support. Casey approached the scenario systematically. She moved from casualty to casualty in less than 2 minutes, conducting rapid assessments that identified the most critical cases while noting treatment requirements for less severely injured Marines. Her triage decisions were textbook perfect. She identified the one casualty who required immediate intervention to survive, provided appropriate field treatment, and coordinated care for the remaining casualties in order of medical priority. But what impressed Chief Hayes most was Casey's performance during the evacuation phase. When the simulated helicopter evacuation was delayed due to enemy contact, Casey single-handedly moved 3 casualties to a more secure location while maintaining their medical treatment. She carried a 180-pound wounded Marine 200 meters through simulated enemy fire, all while managing an IV line and monitoring his vital signs. Morales, Chief Hayes said after the exercise, in 12 years of training medics, I've never seen anyone combine medical knowledge with physical capability the way you just did. That was outstanding performance. The compliment felt different from the praise Casey had received during infantry training. There, her achievements had been measured against standards that seemed designed to exclude her. Here, her capabilities were seen as assets that enhanced her ability to perform the mission rather than complications that needed to be managed. Casey's confidence in her new role grew during advanced combat medical training. She learned to perform emergency surgical procedures under field conditions, to manage complex medication protocols, and to coordinate medical evacuations in hostile environments. Her small size, which had been viewed as a liability in infantry training, proved to be an advantage in many medical scenarios. She could reach casualties in confined spaces, move quickly through terrain that challenged larger Marines, and provide medical care in positions that would be impossible for bigger medics. But perhaps most importantly, Casey discovered that her protective instincts, originally focused on destroying enemies, translated perfectly to protecting Marines through medical care. The same drive that motivated her to train for combat now motivated her to master every aspect of battlefield medicine.
3 months into medical training, Casey received an unexpected visitor. Staff Sergeant Frank Sullivan, her former infantry instructor, appeared at the medical training facility during one of Casey's practical exercises. He watched quietly as Casey treated simulated casualties, noting her speed, efficiency, and calm demeanor under pressure. After the exercise, Sullivan approached Casey during her break. "Morales, I wanted to see how you were adapting to your new specialty." Casey sensed there was more to his visit than casual interest. "It's challenging work, Staff Sergeant. I'm learning a lot." Sullivan nodded thoughtfully. "The reason I'm here is that word has gotten around about your performance. Medical instructors have been talking about you to their counterparts in other training commands. Apparently, you're setting new standards for combat medic capabilities." This was news to Casey. She had been focused on mastering her new specialty, not on comparing her performance to other trainees. "I'm just trying to be the best medic I can be, Staff Sergeant." "That's exactly what I wanted to hear," Sullivan replied. "Because I have a proposition for you. My old unit is deploying to Afghanistan in 6 months. They need an experienced combat medic, and based on what I'm hearing about your training performance, you might be exactly what they're looking for." Casey felt her pulse quicken. A deployment to Afghanistan would mean real-world application of everything she had learned, both in infantry training and medical school. It would also mean proving herself in the kind of high-stakes environment where theoretical knowledge became life-and-death decision-making. "What unit, Staff Sergeant?" 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines. They're a good unit with solid leadership, but they've had some tough deployments. They need a medic who can keep up with infantry operations and provide medical support under the kind of conditions that break some people. Sullivan paused, studying Casey's expression. I won't lie to you, Morales, it won't be easy. You'll be the only female in a male infantry unit operating in a hostile environment. Some of the Marines will be skeptical about your capabilities until you prove yourself. And the enemy doesn't care about your gender. They'll try to kill you just like any other Marine. Casey didn't hesitate. When do I need to be ready? You finish medical training in 2 months. Then you'll have 4 months of pre-deployment training with the unit. The deployment is scheduled for 12 months in Helmand Province, one of the most active areas in Afghanistan. That evening, Casey called her mother to discuss the opportunity. Diana listened carefully as Casey described the deployment and the challenges it would involve. Are you ready for this, Mija? Diana asked. Casey thought about the question seriously. She had been training for combat in one form or another for most of her life. Her medical training had given her skills that could save lives in ways that infantry training never could. And her rejection from infantry had taught her that proving herself would require demonstrating capabilities under real-world conditions. I'm ready, Mom. This is what I've been preparing for. Then go show them what a Marine can do when she's in the right place at the right time. Casey accepted the deployment assignment the next day. She had 4 months to complete her medical training, integrate with a new unit, and prepare for her first combat deployment. It wasn't the path to combat she had originally envisioned, but it was a path that would allow her to prove that size was irrelevant when courage, skill, and determination were unlimited.
Preparing and narrating the story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Master Sergeant Frank Sullivan's reputation preceded him everywhere he went in the Marine Corps. 22 years of active duty, 4 combat deployments, and a chest full of ribbons that told the story of a Marine who had seen the worst warfare could offer and had always brought his people home alive. When Casey reported to 2nd Battalion 8th Marines for pre-deployment training, Sullivan was waiting for her with the kind of expression that suggested he had been evaluating her capabilities since before she walked through the door. Doc Morales, Sullivan said, using the traditional title for all Navy corpsmen and Marine medics, welcome to the magnificent bastards. I hope you're ready to work harder than you've ever worked in your life. The battalion headquarters at Camp Lejeune buzzed with the controlled chaos of a unit preparing for deployment. Marines cleaned weapons, packed equipment, and reviewed intelligence briefings about their upcoming area of operations in Afghanistan's Helmand Province. Casey was assigned to 3rd Platoon, 30 Marines who would become her responsibility for the next 12 months. Her introduction to the platoon was conducted with military efficiency and an underlying skepticism. Platoon Sergeant Gunnery Sergeant Rodriguez, a compact man with arms like tree trunks and eyes that missed nothing, addressed the assembled Marines with characteristic bluntness. Gentlemen, meet your new corpsman. Doc Morales just completed advanced medical training with the highest scores in her class. She's been assigned to our platoon because Staff Sergeant Sullivan believes she can handle the physical and mental demands of infantry operations. Casey stood at attention, feeling the weight of 30 pairs of eyes evaluating everything about her: her size, her demeanor, her confidence level, and her potential to keep them alive when bullets started flying. The silence stretched uncomfortably until one Marine, Lance Corporal Thompson, raised his hand. Gunny, has Doc ever been deployed before? This will be Doc's first deployment, but all of you were new ones. She'll learn what she needs to learn, and you'll teach her what she needs to know. Over the following weeks, Casey immersed herself in learning the rhythm and culture of an infantry platoon preparing for combat. She attended every training exercise, every briefing, and every equipment inspection. She memorized the names, medical histories, and personal details of every Marine in the platoon. She studied the terrain they would be operating in, the enemies they would face, and the medical challenges specific to combat operations in Afghanistan. But it was Master Sergeant Sullivan's informal mentoring that transformed Casey's understanding of her role and capabilities. Sullivan had a way of appearing during Casey's training sessions, offering observations and suggestions that pushed her beyond the standard requirements for combat medics. "Doc, you've got medical training that's better than most Navy doctors," Sullivan said during one of their conversations. "But in a firefight, being a good medic isn't enough. You need to be a Marine who happens to be a medic." Sullivan began incorporating Casey into training exercises that went far beyond standard medical scenarios. He taught her advanced infantry tactics, urban warfare techniques, and small unit operations. He showed her how to read terrain for tactical advantages, how to coordinate with air support, and how to move through hostile territory without being detected. "Why are you teaching me all this?" Casey asked during one particularly intensive training session. "I'm supposed to be providing medical support, not leading infantry operations." Sullivan paused in his instruction and looked at Casey seriously, because in combat, situations don't always develop according to plan. You might find yourself in a position where your medical knowledge isn't enough, where you need to think like an infantry Marine to save Marines' lives. The physical training component of Sullivan's mentoring was unlike anything Casey had experienced, even during her years of self-directed preparation. Sullivan had identified that Casey's greatest asset wasn't just her medical knowledge or her physical fitness, it was her ability to carry heavy loads over long distances while maintaining tactical awareness and medical readiness. Sullivan designed training exercises specific to develop this capability. He had Casey practice casualty evacuation scenarios using Marines from the platoon as patients, requiring her to carry each one over progressively longer distances through increasingly difficult terrain. The exercises started with 200-meter movements on flat ground and eventually progressed to multi-mile evacuations through swamps, hills, and urban environments. "The average combat load for an infantry Marine is 80 pounds, Sullivan explained as Casey prepared for another evacuation exercise. "Add a casualty who weighs 180 pounds and you're looking at moving 260 pounds total. Most people would say that's impossible for someone your size."
Casey adjusted her gear and prepared to lift Lance Corporal Williams, a 190-pound machine gunner, into a fireman's carry. Most people don't understand the difference between lifting weight and carrying weight efficiently. What followed was a demonstration that became legendary among the Marines of 3rd Platoon. Casey carried Williams 3 miles through varied terrain, including stream crossings, steep hills, and dense vegetation. She maintained tactical awareness throughout the movement, responding to simulated enemy contact and navigating to predetermined rally points. Her pace was steady, her breathing controlled, and she showed no signs of the exhaustion that should have been inevitable. But more importantly, she conducted the entire movement while maintaining continuous medical monitoring of her patient. She checked Williams' pulse, monitored his breathing, and maintained communication about his condition throughout the evacuation. When the exercise concluded, she immediately transitioned into treating simulated injuries while coordinating helicopter evacuation procedures. "Holy shit, Doc," Williams said after the exercise. "You just carried me farther than I could carry myself." Word of Casey's capabilities began spreading through the battalion. Marines from other platoons started requesting to observe her training exercises. Officers began discussing how her unique combination of medical expertise and physical capabilities might be integrated into mission planning for the upcoming deployment. Sullivan watched this development with satisfaction and concern. He was proud of Casey's progress, but he also understood that exceptional capabilities created exceptional expectations. In combat, Casey would be expected to perform miracles because she had demonstrated that miracles were within her capabilities. During their final training exercise before deployment, Sullivan pulled Casey aside for a conversation that would prove prophetic. "Doc, in 3 weeks we'll be in Afghanistan, facing an enemy that's been fighting in those mountains for generations. They're skilled, motivated, and they know the terrain better than we do. Our advantage is training, equipment, and the fact that Marines don't quit when things get difficult." Casey nodded,
understanding that Sullivan was building towards something important. "You've trained harder than any Marine I'd ever worked with, Duck. You've developed capabilities that most people would consider impossible. But capability without opportunity is just potential. In combat, you'll face situations where your training, your instincts, and your refusal to give up will be the only thing standing between Marines and death." Casey felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. She had spent her entire life preparing for moments she couldn't predict or control. Now those moments were approaching with the inevitability of the deployment timeline. "Are you ready for that responsibility, Doc?" Casey thought about her mother's stories of carrying wounded soldiers through enemy territory. She thought about years of training with weighted packs in the Arizona desert. She thought about the rejection from infantry training and the journey that had brought her to this moment. "I'm ready, Master Sergeant. Whatever happens over there, I'll be ready." Sullivan studied her expression for a long moment, then nodded with satisfaction. "I believe you will be, Doc. I believe you will be." 3 weeks later, Casey boarded a transport aircraft bound for Afghanistan, carrying 60 pounds of medical equipment and a lifetime of preparation for challenges she couldn't yet imagine. She was no longer the small woman who had been rejected from infantry training. She was Doc Morales, and 30 Marines were counting on her to bring them home alive.
Forward Operating Base Thunder sat in the heart of Helmand Province like a concrete and steel island in an ocean of dust, mountains, and danger. The base housed 800 Marines and soldiers from various units, all focused on the mission of disrupting Taliban operations in one of Afghanistan's most contested regions. When Casey's transport helicopter touched down on the landing pad, the first thing that hit her was the heat. A dry, overwhelming furnace that made North Carolina summers feel like air conditioning. Master Sergeant Sullivan met Casey and the rest of 3rd Platoon at the helicopter landing zone, but his demeanor had shifted from instructor to combat leader. Gone was the patient mentor who had guided Casey's training. In his place stood a Marine who had been fighting in these mountains for 3 months and understood that every decision could mean the difference between bringing Marines home alive or in body bags. "Welcome to FOB Thunder," Sullivan shouted over the noise of outgoing artillery. "The enemy situation has deteriorated since we've been here. Taliban forces have increased their activity, and they're using more sophisticated tactics. Stay alert, follow orders, and remember your training." Casey's first glimpse of her new home was sobering. The forward operating base was a maze of concrete barriers, sandbags, and fortified positions designed to withstand sustained enemy attack. Marines moved with the purposeful urgency of people who understood that complacency could be fatal. The distant sound of gunfire was constant, sometimes close enough to be concerning, always present enough to be a reminder of their environment. 3rd Platoon's area of operations covered a valley system that included 3 Afghan villages, several known Taliban supply routes, and terrain that offered countless opportunities for ambushes. Casey studied the maps and intelligence briefings with the same intensity she had brought to medical textbooks, understanding that knowledge of the area could be just as important as knowledge of trauma treatment. Her first patrol came 48 hours after arrival. The mission was routine by FOB Thunder standards, a presence patrol through one of the villages designed to gather intelligence and demonstrate coalition control of the area. For Casey, it was her introduction to the reality of combat operations in Afghanistan. The patrol consisted of 12 Marines from 3rd Platoon, moving in a tactical formation through terrain that seemed designed to favor the enemy. Rocky hills provided countless hiding spots for snipers. Narrow valleys created perfect ambush locations. The village itself was a maze of mud brick buildings and narrow alleys where threats could appear from any direction. Casey moved with the patrol carrying her standard medical equipment, plus additional supplies requested by Sullivan based on his experience in the area. Her total load was 75 pounds, more than half her body weight.
But she maintained the same pace as Marines carrying similar loads and showed no signs of the fatigue that might have been expected. The patrol proceeded without incident, but Casey could feel the tension that permeated every movement. Marines scanned constantly for improvised explosive devices, enemy fighters, and the subtle signs that distinguished normal village activity from potential threats. Children watched the patrol with expressions that seemed too serious for their ages. Adults observed from doorways but rarely made direct eye contact. This is what 90% of combat operations look like, Lance Corporal Thompson explained to Casey during a brief halt. Endless patrols through areas where the enemy might be anywhere, doing anything, planning something we can't predict. Casey understood that the routine nature of most patrols made the exceptional ones more dangerous. Marines had to maintain perfect alertness during hours of apparent normalcy, knowing that seconds of inattention during a real threat could be fatal. Over the following weeks, Casey participated in dozens of patrols, each one reinforcing her understanding of the operational environment and the challenges facing 3rd Platoon. She treated Marines for minor injuries, heat exhaustion, and the inevitable cuts and bruises that came from operating in hostile terrain while carrying heavy equipment. But she also observed the psychological toll that constant vigilance exacted on the Marines around her. Sleep was always interrupted by incoming mortar rounds, patrol schedules, or guard duty rotations. Stress accumulated from months of never knowing when routine activities might explode into life or death situations. Marines dealt with the pressure differently, some through dark humor, others through obsessive equipment maintenance, most through the kind of professional focus that allowed them to function effectively despite the circumstances. Casey found her role expanding beyond traditional medical support. Her physical capabilities and tactical knowledge, developed during Sullivan's intensive training, made her valuable for missions that required more than standard medical coverage. She began participating in longer-range patrols that pushed deeper into enemy territory, providing medical support for operations that could not rely on rapid evacuation if Marines were wounded.
During one particularly challenging mission, 3rd Platoon was tasked with establishing an observation post on a mountain ridge that overlooked a suspected Taliban supply route. The mission required a 15-mile movement through difficult terrain, carrying equipment for a 3-day surveillance operation. Casey's performance during the movement impressed even experienced Marines who had been skeptical about her capabilities. She carried her full medical load plus additional communications equipment, maintained the patrol's pace through 6,000 feet of elevation gain, and arrived at the objective ready to immediately establish medical support for the observation post. "Doc's got some serious stamina," Private Martinez observed as Casey began setting up her medical station after the grueling movement. "Most corpsmen would be dead after that climb." The observation post mission provided Casey with her first real glimpse of enemy activity. Through spotting scopes and surveillance equipment, the Marines observed Taliban fighters moving supplies through the valley below. The enemy appeared well-organized, well-equipped, and thoroughly familiar with the terrain they were operating in. "They've been fighting in these mountains for 20 years, Sullivan explained as they watched enemy movement patterns. "They know every trail, every hiding spot, every advantage the terrain offers. Our edge is training, equipment, and the fact that we don't quit when things get difficult." Casey studied the enemy fighters through binoculars, noting their movements, equipment, and apparent level of organization. These weren't the disorganized insurgents that some briefings had suggested. They moved with military precision and appeared to be conducting their own surveillance of coalition forces. "Master Sergeant," she said quietly, "they're watching us watch them." Sullivan followed Casey's gaze and confirmed her assessment. Taliban spotters were positioned on adjacent ridges, observing the Marine observation post with the same intensity that Marines were observing Taliban supply operations. "Good eye, Doc. This is why we rotate positions frequently and never stay in one place too long,"
The enemy gets a vote in everything we do. The 3-day mission concluded without direct contact, but Casey understood that she had participated in a chess match where both sides were constantly maneuvering for advantage. The Taliban knew coalition forces were operating in the area. Coalition forces knew Taliban forces were moving supplies through the valley. Both sides were gathering intelligence for future operations that would inevitably result in direct confrontation. As 3rd Platoon prepared to return to FOB Thunder, Sullivan pulled Casey aside for one of their tactical discussions that had become routine during her deployment. "Doc, you've been here 6 weeks now. You've seen how operations develop, how the enemy operates, and how quickly situations can change. What's your assessment of our tactical situation?" Casey considered the question carefully. She had observed dozens of patrols, participated in multiple extended operations, and treated Marines for various injuries and medical conditions. But more importantly, she had developed an understanding of the operational environment that went beyond medical support. The enemy is more organized and better equipped than initial briefings suggested. They're conducting their own intelligence gathering, and they're patient enough to wait for tactical advantages. When they do engage, it's going to be on their terms, in terrain they've chosen, against targets they've studied. Sullivan nodded approvingly. Exactly. Which means when contact does happen, it's going to be sudden, violent, and potentially overwhelming. Are you ready for that? Casey looked out at the mountains surrounding their position, thinking about the Taliban fighters she had observed and the Marines she was responsible for protecting. "I'm ready, Master Sergeant. Whatever happens, I'll be ready."
The mission briefing on September 15th seemed routine by FOB Thunder standards. 3rd Platoon was tasked with conducting a presence patrol through the village of Marja, gathering intelligence on recent Taliban activity, and establishing temporary checkpoints to disrupt enemy movement in the area. The operation was scheduled to last 8 hours, with helicopter extraction planned for 1,800 hours from a landing zone 2 kilometers south of the village. Casey attended the briefing with her usual attention to detail, noting the planned route, potential medical evacuation sites, and the locations of friendly forces that could provide support if needed. Intelligence reports suggested minimal enemy presence in the area, but Sullivan emphasized that intelligence in Afghanistan was often incomplete and sometimes deliberately misleading. "Gentlemen and Doc," Sullivan addressed the assembled Marines, "treat this like any other patrol. Stay alert, watch your sectors, and remember that the enemy gets a vote in everything we do. Questions?" Lance Corporal Thompson raised his hand. "Master Sergeant, what's the backup plan if the LZ is compromised?" "Secondary extraction site is here," Sullivan pointed to a location on the map, about 1 click east of the primary. "If both sites are compromised, we move to this rally point and call for emergency extraction." Casey studied the rally point location, a small compound surrounded by agricultural fields, defensible but isolated from other coalition forces. She hoped they wouldn't need to use it. The patrol departed FOB Thunder at 0600 hours, 12 Marines moving in tactical formation through terrain that Casey had become familiar with over the past 2 months. The morning air was crisp and clear, offering excellent visibility across the valley floor toward the mountains where Taliban forces were known to operate. For the first 4 hours, the patrol proceeded exactly as planned. They moved through 2 villages, conducted interviews with local residents, and established temporary checkpoints that yielded useful intelligence about recent enemy movement in the area. Casey treated a young Afghan boy for a minor cut and provided basic medical supplies to the village elder's wife, who was suffering from an infection. The atmosphere was almost routine, Marines conducting professional operations while local residents went about their daily activities with the wary cooperation that characterized most coalition Afghan interactions. Casey began to think that this would be another uneventful patrol that would conclude with helicopter extraction and return to base for equipment maintenance and mission reports. At 13:45 hours, everything changed. The patrol was moving through an area of scattered compounds between the village and their planned extraction site
when Lance Corporal Rodriguez, walking point, suddenly raised his fist, the signal for immediate halt and danger area. Every Marine instantly froze, weapons ready, eyes scanning for threats. IED, Rodriguez whispered into his radio. Fresh disturbed Earth, 20 meters ahead. Casey's pulse quickened. Improvised explosive devices were the Taliban's weapon of choice for attacking coalition patrols, and their placement often indicated that enemy fighters were nearby, waiting to exploit the chaos that followed an explosion. Sullivan moved forward to assess the situation while the rest of the patrol maintained security. After examining the suspected device, he confirmed Rodriguez's assessment and began coordinating with EOD, Explosive Ordnance Disposal, teams at FOB Thunder for technical guidance on disposal procedures. All stations, this is Thunder Base. EOD team is currently engaged with another incident. Estimate 2 hours before they can respond to your location. 2 hours was an eternity in a tactical situation. The patrol was exposed in an area with limited cover, unable to move forward because of the IED, and increasingly vulnerable to enemy forces who might be positioning for an attack. Sullivan made the tactical decision to establish a defensive perimeter around a nearby compound while they waited for EOD support. The compound offered better protection than their current position and allowed Marines to establish overlapping fields of fire that could repel an enemy attack. All right, people, we're going to occupy that compound and wait for EOD. Standard defensive positions, stay alert, and remember that the enemy gets a vote in everything we do. Questions. At 15:20 hours, the Taliban spring their trap. The attack began with a massive explosion that shattered the afternoon quiet and sent debris raining down on the Marine positions. Casey felt the concussion wave hit her like a physical blow, temporarily disorienting her hearing and vision. Through the dust and smoke, she could hear Sullivan shouting commands and Marines returning fire.
Contact left! Contact left! Multiple shooters in the tree line. Casey's training took over immediately. She low-crawled to the nearest Marine position where Private Martinez was bleeding from shrapnel wounds to his arm and leg. She quickly assessed his injuries, painful but not life-threatening, and began applying pressure dressings while bullets cracked overhead. "Doc, we've got casualties in the building," Thompson shouted over the gunfire. Casey looked toward the main structure of the compound and realized with growing horror that the initial explosion had partially collapsed one section of the building. Dust and debris made it impossible to see clearly, but she could hear voices calling for help from inside the rebel. Sullivan appeared at her side, blood streaming from a cut on his forehead. "Doc, the explosion brought down part of the building. We've got 8 Marines trapped inside, and the structure looks unstable. The roof could collapse completely at any moment." Casey felt her stomach drop. 8 Marines, trapped in an unstable building, under enemy fire, with limited options for extraction or support. The tactical situation was rapidly deteriorating, and conventional rescue procedures would require equipment and personnel that weren't available. "Master Sergeant, what about calling for immediate helicopter extraction for the trapped Marines?" "Negative," Sullivan replied grimly. "Enemy fire is too heavy for helicopters to land safely. We need to get those Marines out ourselves, and we need to do it fast." Casey assessed the situation quickly. The enemy attack was well coordinated and sustained, suggesting a significant Taliban force was positioned around the compound. The trapped Marines were injured and unable to move themselves. The building structure was compromised and could collapse at any moment. Standard rescue procedures would require multiple Marines working together to move casualties, but that would expose rescuers to enemy fire and potentially cause additional casualties. The Taliban were maintaining effective fire on all approaches to the damaged building, making conventional rescue attempts extremely dangerous. "Doc," Sullivan said quietly, "I need options. We can't leave those Marines in there, but I can't risk more casualties attempting a rescue that might not work." Casey looked at the partially collapsed building, estimating distances, calculating risks, and remembering every lesson Sullivan had taught her about unconventional solutions to impossible problems. 8 Marines were counting on her to find a way to save them, and conventional approaches weren't going to work. "Master Sergeant," Casey said, her voice steady despite the chaos around them, "I have an idea, but you're not going to like it." Sullivan looked intently at her. "What are you thinking, Doc?"
I can get them out, one at a time. But I'll need covering fire, and I'll need everyone to trust that I can do something that looks impossible. Casey was thinking about every casualty evacuation exercise Sullivan had put her through, every mile she had run with weighted packs, and every moment of preparation that had brought her to this crisis. She was also thinking about 8 Marines who were depending on her to prove that impossible was just another word for something that hadn't been done yet. "Tell me your plan, Doc." Casey took a deep breath and began explaining how she intended to carry 8 Marines to safety, one at a time, through enemy fire from a collapsing building that everyone said was too dangerous to enter. It was a plan that would require her to exceed every physical and mental limit she had ever tested. It was also the only plan that had any chance of bringing those Marines home alive.
Casey's plan was as simple as it was terrifying. She would enter the unstable building alone, locate each trapped Marine, and carry them individually to safety using the fireman's carry technique she had perfected during thousands of hours of training. The distance from the collapsed section to the defensive perimeter was approximately 80 meters, a distance she would need to cover 8 times while carrying wounded Marines who weighed between 160 and 210 pounds. "Doc, that's suicide," Sullivan said bluntly. "The building could collapse while you're inside. The enemy has clear fields of fire on the route between the building and our positions, and even if you could carry 1 Marine that distance, doing it 8 times under combat conditions is physically impossible." Casey checked her medical equipment, ensuring everything was secured and wouldn't interfere with her movement. "Master Sergeant, remember what you taught me about impossible situations. The question isn't whether something can be done. The question is whether someone is willing to do what it takes." Sullivan studied Casey's expression, recognizing the same determination he had seen during her training exercises. But training exercises didn't include enemy bullets, collapsing buildings, and the kind of physical demands that could kill even exceptional Marines. "What do you need from us?" Sullivan asked. "Covering fire on the building approaches, suppressive fire on known enemy positions during each movement, and medical support ready for when I bring the casualties out." Casey moved to the edge of the defensive perimeter, studying the route she would need to take 8 times. The Taliban fighters had positioned themselves to maintain effective fire on all approaches to the damaged building, but their positions were predictable based on the terrain and the tactical situation. "Thompson, Martinez, Rodriguez, you're going to provide covering fire for Doc's movement. When she moves, you suppress every enemy position you can identify. When she's in the building, you maintain security and prepare for her return movement." Casey took a deep breath and began her approach to the building. The first 40 meters were across open ground that offered no concealment from enemy observation. She moved in a low crouch, using speed and unpredictable movement patterns to avoid presenting a stationary target for enemy marksmen. Bullets cracked past her position as Taliban fighters engaged her movement, but the covering fire from 3rd Platoon forced them to fire quickly and without proper aim. Casey reached the damaged building as concrete and wood fragments showered down around her from enemy rounds impacting the structure. Inside the building, the scene was worse than she had imagined. The roof had partially collapsed, creating a maze of debris, broken timbers, and unstable rubble. She could hear Marines calling for help from different locations within the structure, their voices muffled by dust and debris. "Doc, over here," came a voice from her left. Casey followed the sound and found Lance Corporal Williams trapped under a wooden beam that had pinned his legs. Williams was conscious and alert, but unable to move without assistance. Casey quickly assessed his injuries, possible fractures to both legs, but no immediate life-threatening trauma. "Williams, I'm going to get you out of here, but I need you to help me," Casey said as she began working to free him from the debris. "When I lift this beam, you need to pull your legs free immediately." Casey positioned herself to lift the beam using proper body mechanics, engaging her legs and core rather than relying solely on upper body strength. The beam weighed approximately 80 pounds, but leverage and technique allowed her to raise it enough for Williams to extract his legs. "Can you move?" Casey asked. "Negative, Doc. My legs won't support my weight." Casey helped Williams into position for a fireman's carry, distributing his 180-pound frame across her shoulders in the same technique she had practiced hundreds of times during training. The key was balance and breathing, maintaining control while carrying a load that exceeded her own body weight. The return movement to the defensive perimeter was 80 meters of pure terror and determination.
Casey moved as quickly as possible while maintaining stability, knowing that a fall could injure both her and Williams. Enemy fire intensified as Taliban fighters recognized what she was attempting, but covering fire from 3rd Platoon forced them to remain in covered positions. Casey reached the defensive perimeter with Williams and immediately transferred him to Thompson for medical treatment. She had completed one evacuation, but 7 Marines remained trapped in the increasingly unstable building. "Doc, you can't do this 7 more times," Sullivan said as Casey prepared for her second movement. "You're already breathing hard and the physical demands are going to increase with each trip."
"I can do this," Casey replied, checking her equipment and preparing for the next evacuation. "Those Marines are counting on me." The second evacuation was Corporal Jackson, a 195-pound machine gunner who had sustained a head injury and was semi-conscious. Casey had to clear additional debris to reach him, then carry him through a route that had become more dangerous as enemy fire intensified. The third evacuation was Private Morrison, who had suffered a shoulder injury but remained conscious and alert. Morrison tried to argue that he could walk out on his own, but Casey correctly assessed that his injuries would prevent him from moving safely under fire. By the fourth evacuation, Sergeant Davis, a 210-pound squad leader with multiple shrapnel wounds, Casey was operating on pure willpower and muscle memory. Her shoulders ached from the repeated heavy carries, her breathing was labored, and she was moving through enemy fire that had become increasingly accurate as Taliban fighters adjusted their aim. But she continued moving. Each evacuation required entering the unstable building, locating and assessing injured Marines, clearing debris if necessary, and carrying wounded men across 80 meters of open ground while under enemy fire. The fifth evacuation was complicated by the fact that the building structure had deteriorated further. Parts of the roof that had been stable during earlier movements were now sagging dangerously, and new debris was falling regularly. Casey had to navigate through areas that could collapse at any moment while carrying Lance Corporal Johnson, who had sustained leg injuries. During the sixth evacuation, enemy fire became so intense that Casey had to take cover twice during the movement, protecting both herself and Private Rodriguez while bullets impacted around their position. The physical demands of carrying Rodriguez's 175-pound frame while stopping, starting, and maneuvering to avoid enemy fire pushed Casey beyond anything she had experienced during training. The seventh evacuation tested Casey's limits in ways that made previous movements seem routine. Corporal Mitchell had been trapped deeper in the building, requiring Casey to navigate through areas where the roof had completely collapsed. She had to move debris, create a safe extraction route, and carry Mitchell through terrain that challenged her navigation skills as much as her physical capabilities. By the time Casey prepared for the eighth and final evacuation, she had been operating under combat conditions for over an hour. She had carried more than 1,400 pounds of wounded Marines across 640 meters of enemy-contested terrain. Her uniform was soaked with sweat, her hands were bleeding from moving debris, and her legs were shaking from exhaustion. But Private Taylor was still trapped in the building, and Casey was the only person who could get him out. The final evacuation required Casey to reach the deepest part of the damaged structure, where Taylor had been knocked unconscious by the initial explosion. The route was hazardous even without carrying a casualty. Debris blocked most pathways, the remaining roof structure appeared ready to collapse, and new debris was falling regularly. Casey had to navigate through areas that could collapse at any moment while carrying Lance Corporal Johnson, who had sustained leg injuries. During the eighth and final evacuation, enemy fire became so intense that Casey had to take cover twice during the movement, protecting both herself and Private Rodriguez, while bullets impacted around their position. The physical demands of carrying Rodriguez's 175-pound frame while stopping, starting, and maneuvering to avoid enemy fire pushed Casey beyond anything she had experienced during training. The eighth evacuation tested Casey's limits in ways that made previous movements seem routine. Corporal Mitchell had been trapped deeper in the building, requiring Casey to navigate through areas where the roof had completely collapsed. She had to move debris,
create a safe extraction route, and carry Mitchell through terrain that challenged her navigation skills as much as her physical capabilities. By the time Casey prepared for the eighth and final evacuation, she had been operating under combat conditions for over an hour. She had carried more than 1,400 pounds of wounded Marines across 640 meters of enemy-contested terrain. Her uniform was soaked with sweat, her hands were bleeding from moving debris, and her legs were shaking from exhaustion. But Private Taylor was still trapped in the building, and Casey was the only person who could get him out. The final evacuation required Casey to reach the deepest part of the damaged structure, where Taylor had been knocked unconscious by the initial explosion. The route was hazardous even without carrying a casualty. Debris blocked most pathways, the remaining roof structure appeared ready to collapse, and new debris was falling regularly. Casey had to navigate through areas that could collapse at any moment while carrying Lance Corporal Johnson, who had sustained leg injuries. During the sixth and final evacuation, enemy fire became so intense that Casey had to take cover twice during the movement, protecting both herself and Private Rodriguez while bullets impacted around their position. The physical demands of carrying Rodriguez's 175-pound frame while stopping, starting, and maneuvering to avoid enemy fire pushed Casey beyond anything she had experienced during training. The eighth and final evacuation tested Casey's limits in ways that made previous movements seem routine. Corporal Mitchell had been trapped deeper in the building, requiring Casey to navigate through areas where the roof had completely collapsed. She had to move debris, create a safe extraction route, and carry Mitchell through terrain that challenged her navigation skills as much as her physical capabilities. By the time Casey prepared for the eighth and final evacuation, she had been operating under combat conditions for over an hour. She had carried more than 1,400 pounds of wounded Marines across 640 meters of enemy-contested terrain. Her uniform was soaked with sweat, her hands were bleeding from moving debris, and her legs were shaking from exhaustion. But Private Taylor was still trapped in the building, and Casey was the only person who could get him out. The final evacuation required Casey to reach the deepest part of the damaged structure, where Taylor had been knocked unconscious by the initial explosion. The route was hazardous even without carrying a casualty. Debris blocked most pathways, the remaining roof structure appeared ready to collapse, and new debris was falling regularly. Casey had to navigate through areas that could collapse at any moment while carrying Lance Corporal Johnson, who had sustained leg injuries. 10 minutes later, helicopters arrived to evacuate the wounded Marines and extract 3rd Platoon from the tactical situation. As Casey helped load casualties onto the aircraft, she realized that her rejection from infantry training had led her to exactly where she needed to be, in a position to save lives in a way that no infantry Marine could have accomplished. She had proven that size was irrelevant when courage was unlimited.
The helicopter ride back to FOB Thunder was a blur of medical equipment, concerned voices, and the rhythmic sound of rotor blades that seemed to echo Casey's exhausted heartbeat. She sat strapped to a crew seat, watching Navy corpsmen provide advanced medical care to the 8 Marines she had carried to safety. Williams was receiving IV fluids for shock. Jackson was being monitored for possible traumatic brain injury. Davis required immediate surgery for shrapnel wounds. But they were all alive. 8 Marines who should have died in a collapsed building in Helmand Province were breathing, talking, and going home to their families because one small corpsman had refused to accept the impossible. Master Sergeant Sullivan sat across from Casey during the flight, his own head wound bandaged, but his attention focused entirely on the Marine who had just redefined what the Corps understood about courage under fire. He had been making notes in a small field notebook, detailed observations about Casey's performance that would form the basis of official reports and recommendations that would reach the highest levels of military leadership. "Doc," Sullivan said over the helicopter noise, "when we get back to base, there are going to be a lot of people who want to talk to you. medical officers who want to understand how you carry that much weight over that distance, intelligence officers who want to debrief the tactical situation, senior leadership who want to understand what just happened. Casey nodded, still processing the events herself. Her shoulders ached, her legs were stiff from sustained exertion, and her hands were wrapped in bandages where debris had cut them during the rescue operations. But the physical exhaustion was secondary to the emotional reality of what had occurred. "Master Sergeant, I just did what needed to be done. Any Marine would have done the same thing." Sullivan studied Casey's expression, recognizing both the humility and the misunderstanding that characterized her response. "Doc, that's where you're wrong. Not any Marine could have done what you did. Most Marines wouldn't have attempted it because they would have correctly assessed it as suicide. You succeeded because you have capabilities that exceed normal human limitations." The helicopter touched down at FOB Thunder as medical teams waited to receive the casualties. Casey helped transfer each wounded Marine to stretchers, conducting final medical assessments and providing detailed briefings to the doctors who would continue their care. Her professionalism during the handoff impressed the medical staff, who noted that despite her obvious exhaustion, Casey's clinical judgment remained sharp and her patient advocacy was unwavering. Colonel Jennifer Brooks, the base commander, was waiting in the medical facility when Casey completed her casualty transfer duties. Brooks was a career Marine with 3 combat deployments and a reputation for demanding excellence from her subordinates. She approached Casey with the kind of expression that suggested she was still processing what she had been told about the day's events. "Colonel Morales, I've received preliminary reports about your actions today. Before we proceed with formal debriefings, I want to hear directly from you what happened." Casey provided a concise, factual summary of the rescue operations, focusing on tactical details rather than personal achievements. She described the structural damage to the building, the enemy situation, and the medical conditions of each casualty. Her report was professionally delivered and completely accurate, but it understated the extraordinary nature of her performance. Colonel Brooks listened carefully, occasionally asking clarifying questions about specific aspects of the operation. When Casey finished her briefing, Brooks consulted her notes and looked up with an expression that mixed admiration with disbelief. "Colonel Morales, according to your account and Master Sergeant Sullivan's observations, you carried 8 wounded Marines a total distance of approximately 640 meters while under enemy fire, through unstable terrain, in a time period of just over an hour. Is that assessment correct?" "Yes, ma'am." The combined weight of those 8 Marines was approximately 1,450 pounds. You weigh 115 pounds. You carried more than 12 times your body weight in wounded personnel while under combat conditions. Casey wasn't sure if Colonel Brooks was asking a question or making a statement, so she simply replied, "Yes, ma'am." Brooks closed her notebook and studied Casey thoughtfully. "Colonel Morales, in 30 years of military service, I have never encountered a performance that so completely exceeded what military science considers possible. What you accomplished today will be studied, analyzed, and probably debated for years to come." The formal investigation that followed Casey's rescue operation involved medical experts, tactical analysts, and performance specialists from across the military. Teams of researchers wanted to understand how someone of Casey's size had accomplished feats that exceeded the theoretical limits of human capability under combat stress.
Dr. Sarah Chen, a military physiologist from the Naval Health Research Center, conducted extensive testing to understand Casey's physical capabilities. The results confirmed what Master Sergeant Sullivan had observed during training. Casey's cardiovascular conditioning, muscle efficiency, and biomechanical technique were exceptional even among elite athletes. What's remarkable isn't just her strength or endurance, Dr. Chen explained in her report. It's the integration of physical capability with tactical knowledge and psychological resilience. She performed complex medical assessments while carrying maximum loads under life-threatening conditions. That combination is unprecedented. But the investigation also revealed something more significant than individual exceptional performance. Casey's success had occurred because her unique combination of skills had been developed through training that went beyond standard military requirements. Her medical expertise, physical conditioning, and tactical knowledge had been integrated in ways that created capabilities greater than the sum of their parts. The recommendations that emerged from the investigation were revolutionary. Military leadership began developing new training protocols that emphasized individual capability development rather than standardized minimum requirements. Physical standards were revised to account for technique and efficiency rather than raw strength alone. Most importantly, assignment policies were restructured to identify and utilize unconventional combinations of skills that traditional career fields might overlook. Casey's case became the foundation for what became known as the Morales Protocol, a comprehensive approach to identifying, developing, and utilizing military personnel whose capabilities exceeded conventional categories. The protocol emphasized that exceptional performance often came from individuals whose characteristics didn't fit standard profiles, but whose unique combinations of skills created extraordinary value. The changes weren't limited to the Marine Corps policy. All branches of the military began reviewing their physical standards, assignment procedures, and training protocols to identify opportunities for individuals who might have been overlooked under traditional systems. Casey's rescue had demonstrated that capability was more important than conformity and that the military's most valuable assets might be hiding in plain sight. 6 months after the rescue operation, Casey was promoted to sergeant and assigned to a new position as an instructor at the Field Medical Training Battalion. Her responsibilities included developing advanced training protocols for combat medics and identifying students whose capabilities might exceed standard expectations. But perhaps the most significant recognition came from the 8 Marines whose lives she had saved. Williams, Jackson, Morrison, Davis, Johnson, Rodriguez, Mitchell, and Taylor had all recovered from their injuries and returned to active duty. They requested permission to attend Casey's promotion ceremony, traveling from various bases to witness the recognition of the Marine who had refused to leave them behind. "Sergeant Morales," Williams said during the ceremony, "you carried us out of that building, but you carried our family's hopes out with us. Our children will grow up with fathers because you refused to accept that rescue was impossible." Casey stood at attention as her new rank insignia were pinned to her uniform, surrounded by Marines who understood that exceptional performance came from individuals willing to exceed every limitation when others were counting on them. She had been rejected from infantry training because she was too small for combat, but she had proven that courage came in all sizes. The rejection that had seemed like the end of her dreams had actually been the beginning of something greater. She had found her place in the military not despite her unique characteristics, but because of them. And in finding her place, she had changed how the military understood the relationship between individual capability and collective success. Casey was no longer the small woman who had been turned away from infantry training. She was Sergeant Morales, the Marine who had proven that impossible was just another word for something that required more courage than most people possessed. And she was just getting started.
5 years after the rescue operation in Helmand Province, Casey stood before a classroom of Marine Corps officer candidates at Marine Corps Base Quantico, teaching a course that hadn't existed before her heroic actions changed military thinking. The subject was
Adaptive Leadership and Unconventional Capability Development, a program designed to help future Marine leaders identify and utilize exceptional talent that might not fit traditional categories. Now Staff Sergeant Casey Morales, she wore the ribbons that told the story of her service: the Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism, the Purple Heart for wounds received in combat, and the Combat Action Ribbon that marked her as a Marine who had faced the enemy and prevailed. But the decoration she was most proud of was the instructor badge that recognized her role in developing the next generation of Marine leaders. Who can tell me what the Morales Protocol established as the primary principle for evaluating military personnel? Casey asked the assembled officer candidates. Lieutenant Morrison, no relation to the Private Morrison she had rescued, raised his hand. Ma'am, the protocol established that individual capability should be measured by performance potential rather than conformity to standard physical or demographic profiles. Correct. And why is this principle important for military effectiveness? Because the most valuable capabilities often come from individuals whose characteristics don't fit conventional expectations, ma'am. Casey nodded approvingly. These future officers understood concepts that had been revolutionary just 5 years earlier, but were now fundamental principles of modern military personnel management. The Morales Protocol had transformed how all branches of the military identified, developed, and utilized exceptional talent. The changes had been dramatic and measurable. Military recruitment had expanded to include individuals who might have been overlooked under previous standards, resulting in a 23% increase in personnel who exceeded performance expectations in their assigned specialties. Training programs had been redesigned to develop individual strengths rather than enforce uniform standards, leading to improved overall capability across multiple military occupational specialties. Most significantly, the military had established specialized career tracks for individuals whose combinations of skills created unique value. Casey's own career trajectory exemplified this new approach. She had progressed from rejected infantry candidate to combat medic to instructor to policy advisor, with each assignment building on her demonstrated capabilities rather than forcing her into traditional career patterns. But the impact extended far beyond military policy. Casey's story had become a case study in civilian leadership programs, demonstrating how organizations could discover extraordinary capability by looking beyond conventional qualifications. Fortune 500 companies were implementing Morales-style talent identification programs that emphasize potential and performance over traditional credentials. Staff Sergeant Morales, one of the officer candidates asked during the question period, how do you respond to critics who argue that exceptional cases like yours can't be replicated or systematized? Casey considered the question carefully. It was one she had been asked countless times during congressional hearings, academic conferences, and media interviews that had followed her recognition as one of the most influential military personnel of her generation. The assumption behind that question, Casey replied, is that exceptional performance is rare and unpredictable. But my experience suggests that exceptional capability is much more common than we realize. It's just distributed in ways that traditional systems don't recognize or develop. She gestured to a display board that showed statistics from the 5 years since the Morales Protocol had been implemented. Look at these numbers. We have identified and developed exceptional performers in every military occupational specialty, across all demographic categories, and in geographic regions that were previously underrepresented in military leadership. The statistics were compelling. The military had discovered individuals with extraordinary capabilities in logistics, intelligence, communications, engineering, and dozens of other specialties. Some were small women who excelled in roles requiring agility and precision. Others were physically large individuals whose analytical skills made them exceptional intelligence officers. Many were people whose backgrounds or characteristics had previously limited their opportunities, but whose performance exceeded every expectation when given appropriate challenges. The lesson isn't that everyone is exceptional. The lesson is that exceptional capability takes many forms, and our job as leaders is to create systems that identify and develop that capability wherever it exists. After the class,
Casey walked across the base to her primary assignment as Special Advisor for Personnel Innovation to the Commandant of the Marine Corps. Her office walls displayed photographs that told the story of transformation. Pictures of Marines who had been identified through Morales Protocol assessments and had gone on to achieve extraordinary success in their specialties.
One photograph showed Williams, Jackson, Morrison, Davis, Johnson, Rodriguez, Mitchell, and Taylor at their recent reunion, all successful in their military careers, all healthy and thriving 5 years after Casey had carried them to safety. Williams had been promoted to gunnery sergeant and was leading his own platoon. Jackson had become a drill instructor, training new Marines with the same intensity that had characterized his own service. Taylor had earned a commission and was serving as a platoon commander in the same battalion where Casey had first proved herself. But perhaps the most significant photograph showed a young Marine named Private First Class Sarah Kim, who had been rejected from multiple military occupational specialties due to her small stature before being identified through Morales Protocol assessment. Kim had recently completed the most challenging reconnaissance training in the Marine Corps, excelling in missions that required stealth, endurance, and technical precision. She was now training other Marines in advanced reconnaissance techniques, proving that Casey's example had inspired a new generation of Marines to exceed conventional limitations. Casey's daily responsibilities included reviewing cases of Marines whose capabilities exceeded their current assignments, developing training programs that maximized individual potential, and advising senior leadership on personnel policies that would maintain the military's competitive advantage through superior talent development. But she also maintained her clinical skills as a combat medic, regularly deploying with Marine units to provide medical support and to continue learning about the evolving demands of modern military operations. She had completed 2 additional combat deployments since her promotion, each one reinforcing her understanding that exceptional performance required continuous development and adaptation. The impact of Casey's example extended to her personal life as well. She had married Master Sergeant Frank Sullivan, her former mentor, in a ceremony attended by hundreds of Marines whose careers had been influenced by the changes her actions had inspired. Their partnership represented the kind of professional and personal collaboration that characterized the new military culture emerging from the Morales Protocol reforms. Most importantly, Casey had maintained the humility and focus that had characterized her performance during that critical day in Afghanistan. She understood that her recognition was not about individual achievement, but about proving that exceptional capability existed in unexpected places and could be developed through appropriate challenge and support. During a recent interview with Military Times, Casey had been asked what she hoped her legacy would be. Her response reflected the same practical focus that had motivated her rescue of 8 Marines under impossible conditions. I hope that 10 years from now, no one remembers my name because what I did is no longer exceptional. I hope that discovering and developing extraordinary capability becomes so routine that stories like mine are just examples of what happens when organizations create systems that bring out the best in everyone. As Casey prepared to leave her office that evening, she received a message from Private Kim requesting mentorship advice for a training challenge she was facing. Casey smiled as she composed her response, remembering her own mother's guidance and Master Sergeant Sullivan's patient instruction. The most important thing, Casey wrote, is to remember that your capabilities are limited only by your willingness to exceed what other people think is possible. Figure out what you're uniquely good at, then get so good at it that you make it essential. Casey locked her office and walked toward the parking lot, passing Marines who were finishing their evening training runs. She could see in their determined expressions the same drive that had motivated her own preparation years earlier. The difference was that these Marines were training in an organization that understood that exceptional performance came in many forms, and that the most valuable capabilities often resided in the most unexpected people. She had been told she was too small for combat, but she had carried 8 Marines to safety when conventional wisdom said it was impossible. Her rejection had become her opportunity. Her limitation had become her strength. and her individual achievement had become a catalyst for organizational transformation that would benefit generations of military personnel. Casey Morales had proven that the most important question wasn't whether you met existing standards, but whether you were prepared to exceed every limitation when someone was counting on you to do the impossible. And in proving that point, she had changed not just her own life, but the lives of countless others who would benefit from a military that understood that courage, capability, and character came in all sizes. The stars were beginning to appear in the Virginia sky as Casey drove home, the same stars she had looked at as a young girl dreaming of military service. Her dreams had come true, just not in the way she had originally imagined. Sometimes, she realized, the best dreams were the ones that exceeded your original vision and created possibilities you never knew existed. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.